Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Sharri and here's what's coming up. 3 recently released criminal detainees have been arrested. One for allegedly indecently assaulting a woman in a motel. Another, a former child sex ringleader, for contacting a minor. Kayla Bond and Dave Sharma will discuss more throughout the show. The Reserve Bank has decided to leave cash rates on hold at 4.35%. Economist Leith Van Onselen will analyse what this means for our rates next year. A story tonight I wish I didn't have to report. An anti-Semitic incident against 13-year-old schoolgirls has unfolded in a Sydney shopping centre in broad daylight. The students were targeted because they were wearing their Jewish school uniform. I'll have the full exclusive details coming up. And Israel has raised its travel warning for citizens flying to Australia because of the heightened anti-Semitism in our country. Liz Storer and Paul Murray will discuss later. But first tonight, to the scandal engulfing the Albanese government that 3 newly released criminal detainees have allegedly reoffended. The coalition is now demanding that Albanese sack Home Affairs Minister Clare O'Neil and Immigration Minister Andrew Giles for incompetence. One of these criminals has now been charged with 2 counts of indecent assault, accused of sexually assaulting a woman in South Australia. Another has been charged with drug-related offences, and a third, a former ringleader of a child exploitation gang, has been arrested for making contact with minors. These were the calls today for the ministers responsible to be sacked.
Sack these hopeless ministers, Minister Giles and Minister O'Neil, because the consequences are now writ large. Go and ask the woman in South Australia who was sexually assaulted what she thinks of the way your government has handled this.
The West Australian newspaper today, Anthony De Sigley as the editor, and it says it all. Everything is F_CKED. That's about the only thing you can say about this government at the moment.
They've failed at every step to do that, and they should do the honourable thing and resign. And if they won't resign, the Prime Minister should do the right thing and he should sack them.
But the besieged Albanese government is in hiding, with neither the Prime Minister, Clare O'Neil, nor Andrew Giles fronting the media today. This scandal has been a fiasco from the very start, one failure after another for these inept ministers. The opposition warned that the newly released criminals would likely reoffend after the government failed to prepare for the release of 141, now it's 147 hardened criminals onto our streets ahead of the High Court's ruling. Peter Dutton says the government should have had legislation ready to go from June, but nothing was done. Clare O'Neil initially claimed that she didn't expect the High Court would rule that indefinite detention was unlawful. Then she changed her story to say the government was trying to relocate these criminals to a third country. But then the High Court decision said that no sexual offender has ever successfully been relocated to another country from Australia. Then last night, the Adelaide Advertiser broke the news that an Afghani refugee, Aliyawa Yawari, aged 65, had been charged with 2 counts of indecent assault. This just 3 weeks after he was freed from detention. He was originally locked up after he assaulted 3 elderly women between 2013 and 2014, with a judge describing him as a danger to the community. The alleged sexual assault of the woman, now in Northern Adelaide, took place despite legislation that forces the criminals to wear ankle bracelets. Clearly, these tracking devices do little to prevent criminals reoffending. Now, the story on the front pages of all of the papers today, with calls to explain, as you can see there on the front page of the Herald Sun, how could you let this happen? Well, Peter Dutton says the Prime Minister's weakness is unbelievable and the criminals need to be back in detention.
This was all predictable and it was avoidable. The Minister's made catastrophic mistakes in his decision-making and Unfortunately, now that they've released 147 people in total with a potential 340 more, the very high likelihood is that there will be more victims, and it's avoidable and it's a tragedy.
While all of us now are looking at this scandal, thinking about the new victims and wondering how the government could truly be capable of such incompetence, well, there was one body which celebrated the High Court's decision to release these criminals onto our streets. The Australian Human Rights Commission welcomed the High Court's ruling, with Deputy General Counsel Graham Edgerton writing in an email, "This is an amazing outcome that will have a practical impact for up to 92 people who are currently in immigration detention and may allow many former detainees to seek compensation for unlawful detention." An amazing outcome, he says. This is the Human Rights Commission. It seems they care more about the human rights of criminals rather than the human rights of women and children to live in safety. Now, the news has emerged in the final parliamentary sitting week this year, but the House wasn't sitting today, meaning that Anthony Albanese, Claire O'Neill and Andrew Giles went into hiding. It was left to NDIS Minister Bill Shorten and Finance Minister Katie Gallagher to clean up their mess.
The logic of that is that the High Court should resign if you really think that there was some way to prevent this. The reality is the High Court has made its decision. That is their right and prerogative in our judicial system. Once the reasons were made available for the High Court decision a week ago, the ministers have moved with utmost speed.
Well, I can say that we've done everything that we can to ensure that we are keeping the community safe. It's been front and centre of our response since the High Court threw out a law that had been operating for 20 years. The government didn't have a choice about whether these cohort of detainees were released.
Everything we can to keep the community safe, says Katie Gallagher. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But even radio hosts in Adelaide, David Pemberthy and Will Goodings, asked why the minister in charge of disabilities was having to answer questions about this instead of the Prime Minister.
This is an absolute disgrace. I'm just looking. Albo last night was at a book launch. He was launching a book about the former tourism minister. What's his name? Brown. Bit of hits and memories there, JJ Brown. Why is the bloke who's in charge of the NDIS leading the explanations?
It seems Albanese hasn't done a press conference with the Canberra Press Gallery since October the 22nd, over a month ago. It's why some veterans of the gallery are starting to accuse him of a lack of transparency. But Albanese and his ministers can't hide forever. Question time in the lower house is back on Thursday, and they'll all have to face the music then. But one other point on all of this. Over the past few weeks, the Albanese government has promised they were protecting the community, and there was nothing to fear from these newly released criminals. As you heard, Katie Gallagher was still making this claim today.
At every turn in the way the government has handled this matter, we have focused on one thing and one thing only, and that is the safety of the Australian community.
We take community safety very, very, very seriously. In fact, it is our utmost priority.
Well, I can say that we've done everything that we can to ensure that we are keeping the community safe.
And yet, we've heard the same promises about the 860 people the Albanese government is bringing to Australia from Gaza. These Palestinians aren't Australian citizens, they're not Australian residents, but Albanese is giving them protection visas to live here. They're coming from the front line of this war, and Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese say that security checks have been done to make sure that they aren't affiliated with Hamas or another terror group. But then Australia has no presence in Gaza at all, no consulate presence in Gaza. And the opposition has pointed out that usually security checks take months. That's what ASIO says, not days or weeks. Now, the government hasn't answered our question over recent weeks about how are these security checks physically being done, given Australia has no access to Gaza. But the question is, can we still trust Albanese's word when he promises the community will be safe, firstly, from these criminal detainees. They weren't able to fulfil their promise in that instance, so how can we trust them that they're not flying into Sydney and Melbourne, Hamas sympathisers, or even worse? This government is looking increasingly weak on national security. There's no escaping that the Albanese government failed to have legislation ready to go ahead of the High Court decision. And they're now scrambling to get preventative detention laws passed this week. It means that every victim of these criminal detainees are on Albanese's head and his conscience. Instead of cowardly crawling into hiding, Albanese, Claire O'Neill and Andrew Giles should be standing up today, holding a press conference and apologising to the poor victims of their incompetence. And now to some exclusive breaking news from us. A criminal released from immigration detention a year ago has reoffended and been charged with attempting to dishonestly take property without consent and committing assault. Those involved in the case of Akik Akek thanked the Immigration Minister Andrew Giles for his role in his release from immigration detention. A Facebook post from supporters states, and you can see it here, "We are very relieved to welcome back Akek Akek after nearly 5 years in immigration detention. Thank you, Andrew Giles, and those who supported us to follow this through." Now, despite this Facebook post, a government source said that Andrew Giles did not release the individual and that it was the federal court's decision to do so. But less than a year later, Akek has been charged with attempting to dishonestly take property without consent and with committing assault. He was due to face court today in Adelaide, but it's been adjourned until January. Joining me now to discuss this and the rest of the day's top stories is Sky News host Caleb Bond. The government ministers responsible in hiding, the Minister for Disabilities and for Finance having to step into the fray to shield questions. Look, the public must be worried about their safety.
Well, it's hard to see how this could get any worse for the federal government, and they haven't helped themselves in this regard. As you note, I mean, the simplest thing would be for the Home Affairs Minister, Claire O'Neill, or the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, or the Immigration Minister, Andrew Giles, to be out on the front foot today and saying, "We are very sorry, we should have had legislation up earlier." Because the reality is the decision was handed down by the High Court on November the 8th. That's 25 days ago, nearly a month ago, we had that decision. And at no point until this week have we seen any legislation that could have re-detained these people. So for the government to suggest that, this wasn't our fault, we didn't want to be in this position, we never wanted these people out, I accept that you didn't want them out, but you missed the opportunity to do something about it. And now you have 3 people accused of reoffending, you're on the hop, and there's no ministers, except for ministers who don't deal with these portfolios, out talking to people. If they think that's going to wash, they've got another thing coming.
Yeah. Now, we've got some breaking news from the Bruce Lerman defamation case. Britney Higgins took the stand today, and a Sydney court has heard that she was paid around $2.3 million as part of compensation, and that after legal costs and taxes, Britney Higgins confirmed that she was left with $1.9 million in her settlement with the government for them failing their duty of care. As all of our viewers will no doubt recall, this was the process whereby Linda Reynolds and others claim that they were blocked from giving evidence from their side of the story, and that they've accused the Albanese government of just paying the money to Britney Higgins. They requested a corruption inquiry. We haven't heard whether or not that's going to happen. What do you think the public reaction will be, Caleb, to the news that Britney Higgins, breaking just today, received $2.3 million in compensation? She says $1.9 million after taxes and legal fees.
Probably won't be surprised because, of course, we already knew that there was money in the vicinity of 2 to 3 million, but questions will be asked, I'm sure, because, of course, we're talking about a case here where there was no criminal conviction achieved. And so as a taxpayer, it's not unfair to ask the question, for what are we compensating? What is the government admitting happened if there is no criminal basis that it actually happened? There is no proof, no criminal proof in a court of law that anything happened. And of course, at the same time, you've got Linda Reynolds running a defamation case against Britney Higgins herself. Yeah. The government, until this point, had refused to detail the money they had given to Higgins. They said it was a confidential matter. She's chosen to reveal that in court today. But it certainly raises questions around why exactly she was due that money when nothing has ever been confirmed and no conviction has ever been achieved.
Yeah. Now, another big story today, I couldn't believe this when I first heard it, and then actually I thought about it and I thought, well, it makes perfect sense. Israel has issued a travel warning for its Israeli citizens against flying to Australia. So they say, the Israeli government is saying that the anti-Semitism is so high in Australia that it's not safe for Israeli citizens to travel here. I mean, you know, we've been talking on this show every single night for weeks, well, since October 7, about this explosion in anti-Semitism. But, you know, to actually think that it's not safe for Israelis, and I guess you can't blame them for making the decision when you look at how the families of the hostages and, you know, those killed in the October 7 attacks were treated at the Melbourne hotel last week.
Yeah, I don't think you could blame them at all. Australia is one of 80 nations that have had their ranking upgraded in terms of threat level. Advice for people who travel overseas, and the advice is to take precautionary measures. Britain and Germany and many other nations are included. But when you think about it, not just that event we saw last week, which was ugly and disgusting, but think back to October the 8th. I mean, that was how early all of this kicked off in Australia, on the steps of the Opera House with people shouting "Gas the Jews," that the New South Wales Police have now sent off to experts to determine whether or not they actually said "Gas the Jews." I mean, that's how absurd all of this has been. It is no surprise at all that Israel would warn people against travelling, or at least take some precautions when nothing has been done by police or government to stem that anti-Semitism.
Kayla Bond, thank you so much for your time. We'll see you tonight at 10 o'clock on The Late Debate.
Cheers.
Now, coming up, we have exclusive and very sad details about the Sydney schoolgirls who were caught up, involved, the victims of an anti-Semitic incident just yesterday. Dave Sharma will join me to discuss this. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, as we've been discussing, overnight, Israel issued a travel warning to its citizens against flying to Australia because of the extreme anti-Semitism. Israel says travel to Australia for Israelis is no longer safe. And who can blame them after the horrific protest against the families of Israelis kidnapped or killed at a Melbourne hotel last week? The protest taking place inside the hotel. But I wonder if Australia is now feeling unsafe, not just for Israelis, but for Jews. We know there's been a 5-fold increase in anti-Semitic incidents, but tonight I can sadly reveal one incident that will break your heart. A group of 13-year-old girls were sitting in their Jewish school uniform at Westfield Bondi Junction in Sydney just yesterday. They were in the food court chatting. I'm not going to name the school. I don't want to draw attention to it or put anyone at risk, but they were 13-year-old girls. Someone from the level above them started throwing food at them, beef jerky. It hit one of the girls on the head. The girls moved away. Then a box that looks like it had been under the shopping centre Christmas tree landed just next to them. They saw that it had several swastikas etched and drawn on it. You can see the box on your screen now. Several swastikas. This is the box. The Jewish Board of Deputies is now involved. New South Wales Police have confirmed to us they're investigating, and Westfield is analysing its security footage. I spoke to the mothers of one of the girls today. She told me that her family isn't going to let this anti-Semitism stop them from being proud Jews. She told me, my daughter asked me afterward if I would let her go with friends again to the junction. I said, without hesitation, you can go. She then asked me if she should wear her uniform. I said, absolutely yes. We need to be proud of who we are and show no fear in the face of the hate that's designed to scare us. Strong words, both from that 13-year-old girl and her mother. This is nothing to do with Israel. This is the harassment and targeting of young Jewish schoolgirls, all because they're Jewish. It's disgraceful. This is what's now happening in Australia every single day. The horrible targeting of Australian Jews, including school students, just because of our religion. Peter Dutton is right. Anti-Semitism needs to be on the agenda of National Cabinet. Why won't Albanese do this? He's the Prime Minister for all Australians, not just voters in marginal Labor seats where the voters might not support Israel. He needs to take seriously this continued rise in anti-Semitism. He needs to stop the erosion of social cohesion in this country, and he can start by clearly putting it on the agenda at National Cabinet, speaking out about it, making it clear that it's unacceptable. It needs to be a top priority because innocent Jewish Australians, schoolgirls just minding their business, are being unfairly targeted. And by the way, our media isn't helping because the ABC and other left-wing outlets keep amplifying false claims that Israel is committing war crimes and killing innocent Palestinians. Israel is not doing this, as you know. But again, just last night, the ABC decided to platform a Jew who doesn't support Israel. Publisher Louise Adler clearly made the case on the ABC that what's going on now in Gaza is like the Holocaust. Have a look.
It is important and it is vital for us not to look away, that we all have a choice, that the world looked away during the Second World War and Jews, 6 million of our people, were murdered in that looking away, and that it is incumbent upon humanity to look at what is happening in Gaza now and to say, we will not accept this. We will say no, not in our name.
And that's on the ABC's flagship current affairs program, the 7:30 Report. What she said is wrong. It is extremely, extremely offensive. People who actually experienced the Holocaust, and I speak to them, they email me, are devastated by the current rise of anti-Semitism. 100 Holocaust survivors signed a letter, if you'll remember, it was on the front page of The Australian, calling for an end to the anti-Semitism we're seeing. What's happening in Gaza now is nothing like the Holocaust. It couldn't be further apart. Israeli soldiers are sending text messages, making phone calls, staying on the phone to people in Gaza until they've evacuated their apartment before they strike. They're making every effort to save civilian lives. It's Hamas that's putting Palestinians in danger. It's Hamas to blame for the loss of Palestinian lives. But what's curious is that not once in that very long interview last night did Laura Tingle ask Louise Adler about the terrorist attack on October 7. And Louise Adler did not think to mention it. And why can't the ABC instead interview on its high-profile platform Jews who actually support Israel like most of our community do? Well, joining me now is Liberal Senator and former Australian Ambassador to Israel, Dave Sharma. Dave, thank you so much for your time. Your first week back in the Senate, so again, congratulations. Now, I want to first get your reaction to this anti-Semitic incident targeting 13-year-old schoolgirls at Bondi Junction in Sydney yesterday.
It's horrific, Sharri. I can't think of any other word to describe it. It's a stain on our national character, the idea that young schoolgirls are being targeted, harassed, vilified in their local shopping centres simply for the fact that they're Jewish. Unfortunately, this is not an isolated incident, as you well know, but we are failing as a society to combat anti-Semitism, and we're failing as a society to support multicultural Australia by our failure to stand up against this. I mean, I know the shopping centre well. I do my groceries there on a Saturday. I'm almost certain I know the school as well. And the idea that 13-year-olds who have nothing to do with this conflict whatsoever are being made to feel responsible and being made to feel threatened and unwelcome in their own country is an absolute stain on our national character, Sharri.
Absolutely, and let's hope the police take this seriously and take action. Now, what do you think about that report I just showed a snippet from of the ABC 7:30 report giving a platform to Louise Adler instead of any of the tens of thousands and tens of thousands again of prominent Jewish Australians or any Jews who actually support Israel?
Well, I thought it was a very one-sided interview. It didn't present different perspectives on this conflict. I thought the analogy with the Holocaust was incredibly distasteful and entirely wrong factually. I mean, there is one party to this conflict who does want to commit genocide, and that is Hamas. This is in their national charter. They've, after the October 7th terrorist attacks, they announced their intention to conduct more of these attacks until Israel is eradicated from the Middle East and the Jewish people are forced to flee. That is the party that has a genocidal intent here, not Israel, which is exercising its right to self-defence, not Israel, which is taking all the precautions we could expect of any state operating in a theatre of war like this one to protect civilian lives. And I think, look, unfortunately, this is feeding into the levels of anti-Semitism we're seeing in Australia, and we have our political leaders now who have licence, and there's some prominent Labor front benches who are continually dog whistling about Israel and war crimes, Israel and genocide, and that is telling the protesters, go for your lives. You know, it's giving them a green light to engage in this sort of behaviour, and this is why we're failing. And you know, this is why absolutely Anthony Albanese should be treating this issue as a matter of national priority. Absolutely, he should be raising it with the National Cabinet. Absolutely, he should be getting state premiers and their law enforcement officers on board to send a strong signal to the entire Australian community that this sort of behaviour that we're seeing, whether it's at Westfield Bondi Junction, whether it's in that hotel in Melbourne, whether it's at synagogues in Caulfield, is just not acceptable in Australia.
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree with you more, and I think, you know, that's the thing. That's why it's so irresponsible for the ABC to have an interview like that, because viewers will think, oh, there's a Holocaust going on in Gaza. And then, you know, people get angry because they're swallowing this inaccurate reporting, and that does feed into the anti-Semitism. You're 100% right. Now, Dave Sharma, just quickly before you go, obviously you've been in the Senate today. The House isn't sitting. The focus of the Senate was on the 3 criminal detainees who've now reoffended. Do you agree that Albanese should sack Claire O'Neill and Andrew Giles?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, heads should roll for this. I can't tell you how many points of failure there have been here now, Sharri. Not only was the High Court decision not anticipated, despite clear warnings from the Chief Justice earlier in the year, not only was the administrative detention regime not legislated beforehand, not only did the government fail in its arguments it's made, but the government also released much more than the single individual who was subject to this litigation. They released a whole bunch of other people, and we're now reaping the whirlwind from that. That we've already seen 3 of these people who are released reoffend or breach their conditions, been hauled before magistrates, charged again. I mean, how long will it take for this government to recognise its own failings, to hold ministers accountable and to rectify this situation? In the Senate today, we've been asking the government to bring on the legislation because we want to help them deal with it. We want to help fix their incompetence. We want to help clean up their mess. But they have to show some willingness themselves.
All right, Dave Sharma, thank you so much for joining me, your first week back in the Senate. Now, a Sydney court has heard today that Britney Higgins was paid around $2.3 million, and after legal costs and taxes, she confirmed she was left with $1.9 million in her settlement with the government for failing in their duty of care. Today concludes her cross-examination in Bruce Lerman's defamation trial against Channel 10 and Lisa Wilkinson. Kenny Heatley, who is covering the trial, joins us now. Kenny, it's been a tough day for Britney Higgins in court.
That's right, Sharri. It was a gruelling day of testimony for Britney Higgins, crying multiple times as Bruce Lerman's lawyer, Steve Whybrow, probed her version of events of the night of the alleged rape. And one of those times that she did break down was when the court was played CCTV from inside Parliament House. Steve Whybrow saying, I want to suggest to you, you don't look 10 out of 10 drunk or in any distress at that point. Do you accept that? With Miss Higgins saying, I hadn't been raped yet, but I was skipping in the middle of Parliament with no shoes on, so it indicates someone who's pretty drunk. Mr Whybrow suggested Miss Higgins took herself into former Defence Industry Minister Linda Reynolds' office and laid down on the couch because she was feeling sick. I don't know. After being on the ledge, the next thing I know was Bruce raping me on the couch. I don't know how I got to the couch. Miss Higgins was then pressed about how she came to be in an undressed state. Steve Whybrow saying, you accept that that's a possibility, that you took your dress off before you laid down on the couch? Miss Higgins' response, it's not something that would ever happen. I don't know that that's not true, but I don't recall. And it just seems I don't recall. The court also heard Miss Higgins was on a Bumble date on the night of the alleged rape, but he left after Miss Higgins admitted to being rude to him. She also denied deleting text message exchanges off her phone between herself and the man she was on a Bumble date with, and a Parliament House security guard she was also planning to go on a date with, but never did, before handing her phone to police for the investigation. Sharri, the judge-only trial is expected to conclude at the end of next week.
All right, Kenny Heatley, thank you for that update. Now, still to come, more brutal accounts of Hamas savagery against women are emerging. But where are the feminists condemning this gender violence? Paul Murray and Liz Storer will join me, and we're also going to talk about that immigration scandal. Stay tuned. If you're just tuning in, here are the top 5 stories you need to know tonight. 3 criminal detainees who were released after the High Court ruling have been arrested as the opposition says more alleged offences are likely. The RBA has decided to leave the cash rate on hold at 4.35% in their final decision for the year. A Sydney court has heard that Britney Higgins was paid $2.3 million, and Higgins confirms she was left with $1.9 million in this settlement with the government for failing their duty of care. Perth Greenpeace activists scaled a 140-metre crane outside oil and gas giant Woodside's headquarters in Perth, accusing the company of being Australia's biggest climate threat. And Israel has raised the travel warning for Australia, urging citizens to exercise increased precautionary measures because of our levels of anti-Semitism. All right, let's bring in now our Sky News hosts, Liz Storer and Paul Murray.
Morning.
Favourite panel of the week.
God love you.
What about this story? We're going to get to the immigration scandal in a minute, Hamas savagery in a minute, but the ABC's report into its Voice to Parliament coverage found that it was dominated by yes voices and breached 4 editorial standards. It seems like we had more balance over here at Sky News than the ABC did.
That's even when they get to mark their own homework, Sharri. Don't forget, they have failed when they've marked their own homework.
So 51% of voices on the referendum were in favour, this review found, 23% opposed. Paul, that's clearly not balance in this debate.
Oh, there were so many unsure voices too.
Yeah,
I mean, that's what you could tell.
Unsure.
You could see there was a lot of undecideds.
Oh, they just kept you guessing the whole way. You were like, yeah, but where do they stand on
Yeah, I mean, when I turned on Q&A, obviously, undecided voter. When I turned on the 7:30 report, undecided voter. When I turned on the breakfast show, undecided voter, let alone Radio National. I mean, that was the home of the undecided
I just love how
vote.
they present the facts and they want you to make up your own mind.
And I appreciate that from the media.
Absolutely, we're intelligent people.
That we come to trust. I don't want them to find passive-aggressive ways of making the same point over and over and over again on the taxpayer's dollar.
But how useless is this report, right? Because firstly, we know the government's not going to do anything about it. Like, how dare you be selling the message that we were selling ourselves for months on end, like literally waterboarding the public with vote yes. Yeah. So we know that the government's going to do absolutely nothing about it. I'd love to know how much was spent on it. All I want to know is, why didn't you ask me? Because we could have told you for free. Like, we didn't have to spend anything.
I feel like they now need to do a similar review on coverage of the Israel-Hamas war, because I can tell you the results would be much worse than the referendum.
Well, again, their fundamental issue is that they're going to turn around and say, well, you know, we have to tick boxes and our guests are 50-50. But if anyone sees shows like The Drum, there's no conservative Liberals. There might be a Liberal there, but of course, a far left Liberal that's there. So inevitably, in this context, and what you're talking about with Louise Adler, there'll be, well, how many Jewish people have we had on versus how many Palestinian people? What type of which is the conversation?
Exactly. It's like the Walkleys giving the Book of the Year award to Anthony Lowenstein. They can say, oh, we gave it to a Jew, but it's a Jew who hates Israel who wrote a book called The Palestine Laboratory.
Well, the horrible thing is that I've somewhat worked through many years ago the concept of the people who want to maintain control of the narrative being honest about the narrative. The people expecting them that despite the fact that they get to pretend that they're the 50-50 people and the umpires, they're really the participants in the game. So it is frustrating, it is aggravating. Supposedly, when you're taxpayer funded, there's supposed to be all these other rules. But my belief is that time after time, institution after institution, we have seen the failures of those institutions. When the UN has failed, then okay, next time they turn around and complain about something in Australia, dismiss. The next time people come out wanting to sort of talk about important feminist issues, but they've been silent on what's happened in and around the Middle East, then guess what? They get to be ignored. As disappointing as these moments are, they're incredibly freeing, aren't they, Liz? Because
the silence tells us everything.
You're not fair dinkum, I'm out.
The silence tells us everything, but with these bodies, there seems to be no accountability. Whether you're talking about the UN or whether you're talking about the AVC, laughably, The Guardian came out today and told all their journos and the people who work for them, you've got to stop your opinion, like
signing
letters, this petition, etc., and so on. Like, we don't know where people who work for The Guardian
their headlines are undecided about BB.
On the war. Yeah, exactly.
25 of The Guardian's journalists, cartoonists, contributors we know have already signed the anti-Israel letters, so we know where they stand.
Exactly. So this is nothing more than a virtue signal to be like, oh, come on, guys, remember journalism, we're totally bipartisan here. That ship has sailed, Guardian, and well, you know it. You're now just trying to grasp whatever semblance of legitimacy you have as a journalistic, a media outlet. It's long gone.
In between begging for donations.
Oh, exactly. Well, speaking of UN and similar bodies, we have not seen any women's groups or any high-profile feminists come out and condemn the rape, the savagery that Hamas, committed against women, against teenage girls in the October 7 attacks. There was this really devastating article, I'm not sure if everyone's read it, in The Australian over the weekend. It originally came from the Sunday Times. It was by their former chief foreign correspondent, Christina Lamb. And she she speaks to some of the people who survived the music festival massacre, and she speaks to them about what they saw, and they saw women being raped and then having their heads cut off. She did an interview. I mean, it's a print article, but then she did an interview on Piers Morgan. Here's what she had to say.
I talked to a lot of people, but in particular I talked to survivors of the Supernova Music Festival, which was one of the places that was attacked by Hamas on October the 7th. And some of those people told me about witnessing girls being raped, gang raped, and one man in particular who hid under the body of a woman that was shot and then was for hours trying to get out of there. He saw a number of girls being raped, but he told me in particular about one who was raped by about 10 Hamas fighters. And she was just begging them to kill her, actually, because it was just so horrific what they were doing. And he said that she had the face of an angel and that he wakes every night now to see that face.
Liz, I mean, there's so much evidence of this, and why haven't any of the international women's groups, why haven't any of the famous feminists and influencers, even here in Australia, come out to speak about this?
Well, firstly, it's Jew hatred, 100%. Well, people like to call it anti-Semitism. I don't use that word. Some people don't even know what it means. It's Jew hatred for some. For others, they're simply not willing to take a side even when moral clarity demands it in this situation. I'm familiar with the story that she just relayed and many others of the atrocities that happened against women on that day. And it's the kind of stories you regret reading, but you know that you must, because that is what helps people form a moral clarity around what happened that day and therefore what must be done in the coming months until Hamas is eradicated. Exactly. Israel's doing this for the rest of the world. And everyone's screaming free Palestine. Like I like to say, Israel's like, yeah, we're doing it as fast as we possibly can, okay? We're on the job. But we see, with these UN bodies and others, we see this in other issues like child brides, which any of us would agree is utterly reprehensible, should never be happening. These little girls sold off to old men. This happens in certain countries that the UN will never condemn. But we all know if it were the IDF who had done this to Palestinian women, we'd never hear the end of it. And the UN would have never shut up about it from that day to this. It is downright one-sidedness, and it's because they are pushing this narrative that they want everyone to adopt, to either be pro-Palestinian or so confused they don't know what to believe.
It's a big problem, these international bodies. I don't know what the solution is. Paul, I want to ask you about the other big story of today that we've been covering on the show, these 3 criminals who've now been rearrested.
Look, I always say on the show, clueless Claire O'Neill, because she is. Now, the thing is that this Labor Party does not want to play a tough hand on national security, right? Their position has been ISIS brides, come back into the community. Sure, they get annoyed about it on Sky News primetime, but just we'll keep moving through, right? These are the people who turned around and said 50,000 people who came here illegally via boats. We're going to take away temporary protection visas. You now fully move into the community. Again, the assumption they'll be angry on Sky News, but who cares? They thought that this was going to be a process story that would come and go. We'd be angry about it on Sky News, but they'd be able to step away from it. But things are so egregious, so ridiculous, that we're in this scenario where if the government had any chance to slow play the ball by who got released on what particular day, we also learned today, massive news, that personally intervening on the behalf of the bloke who was bringing the case in the High Court was the Human Rights Commission, which was given the permission to do so by the Attorney-General. This only gets worse before it gets better, and if the Prime Minister thinks it gets better by Parliament coming up, well, all of these things go back to court in January.
Now, Paul, you are doing amazing work on your show. You don't just have a platform here at Sky, but you use it to raise money for children and other people who need it. Tell me what your campaign is right now with Humpty Dumpty.
God love you. One of the worst things about when a little kid gets sick, and you all know my experience with this, is that sometimes when you sit in the intensive care section for babies, you look around and you notice that there's little gold plates on the heart machine or a gold plate on the breast pump. And you go, oh, what's that? And then you notice they've been donated. Now, amazingly, despite all the tax, all the rest of it, this stuff has to be donated via a thing called the Humpty Dumpty Foundation. Now, the Humpty Dumpty Foundation have got the requests from every hospital in the country about the stuff that they need. We go, of course, to a country town every single month, which means I would like to leave behind as the legacy of us being there stuff for the babies. We did it in Mildura, more than $100,000. We need about $40,000 for the kids of Port Lincoln. If you can, go to the Humpty Dumpty website or just find my socials, or as the magnificent Sharri team have put in place.
There you go.
Give them a call this afternoon, write it down, 1300 486 789. I know it's tough, cost of living, all the rest of it, but if you're thinking about, what do I give that person who I no idea what to give, do this in their name, help out a kid in regional Australia. Thank you.
Paul, you have a big heart and we all love you. Thank you.
It's a big frame outside of it too.
Right. Paul Murray, Liz Storer, see you both tonight, 9, 10 o'clock. After the break, economist Leith Van Onselen will break down the RBA's decision today. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, today the RBA decided to keep cash rates on hold at 4.35% in the final rate decision for the year. Meanwhile, Treasurer Jim Chalmers has suggested there could be another round of cost of living relief included in next year's budget should the economy soften. Joining me now, macro business chief economist Leith Van Onselen. Leith, welcome to the program again. Look, we're starting to see a difference in the Australian experience to overseas. We're seeing inflation fall faster overseas, an expectation that rates might actually start to fall overseas. Why is Australia not having the same success?
Look, it basically gets down to our services inflation has been a little bit stickier than overseas. But that said, our inflation pretty much across the globe, it's falling everywhere. It's just ours isn't quite coming down as quickly. And one of the major reasons for that is, and I say it every time I'm on here pretty much, the federal government's obviously running this record immigration program, and it's growing the population so quickly in Australia that's basically adding to this demand pressures across the economy. And that's not happening in most other countries. Most other countries, their populations aren't growing so quickly, so their demand's not growing as quickly. And that's basically, helping to keep Australia's inflation higher than it otherwise would be. And we're seeing that most notably in the rental market, obviously, where rents are going through the roof, and rents are actually the second biggest component of the CPI. So when rents rise, it puts upward pressure on inflation.
Look, we're seeing the Treasurer put forward this suggestion about having another cost of living relief package. In the past, he said that the government was loath to do that because of the inflationary impact that it could have. Are you concerned about this?
Well, it really depends how it's designed. So if you just obviously give dollars to households go out and spend it, and that'll put upward pressure on demand. But if you do other things, and you can actually use those subsidies to bring down prices. So, for example, if they cut the fuel excise, I'm not saying they should, that would lower inflation, or alternatively, childcare subsidies, energy rebates, rental rebates. Those things can actually bring down prices, at the margin, and that'll actually, reduce inflationary pressure. So it all depends on how it's designed.
Look, we are seeing inflation start to fall, as you mentioned, in Australia, not just globally. The recent figures, it's at 4.9%. But there are concerns that the RBA has expressed that we're still not going to get to that target band of 2 to 3% by the end of 2025. So do you think that Australians are looking at higher rates, higher inflation for a longer period?
Look, I said it last time, I actually think we're probably at the peak of the cash rate, purely because a whole lot of indicators are coming off. That said, I think we're going to have these high-ish interest rates for an extended period. And again, it gets back to these, the same forces. The federal government has basically got its foot on the accelerator, bringing in a whole bunch of consumers through immigration, record numbers, and that's sort of keeping the pedal on demand while the RBA is trying to slow demand with interest rates. So we've got basically the federal government and the RBA working at cross purposes, and that's obviously not helping the situation here in Australia.
No, it's so concerning. Are you willing to give a prediction for when we might start to see rates actually fall?
Oh, look, this is really a stab in the dark. Probably, not probably, maybe late next year. Once the economy really does start to soften, which I think it will.
Yeah.
But that being said, we could, we could have another 12 months roughly of these sort of highish rates, which is pretty abysmal, obviously, if you're a mortgage holder. And,
it is indeed.
It's not great.
A long time still to come for this cost of living crisis. Leith Van Onselen, appreciate your time as always. And that's all for tonight. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you tomorrow at 5 p.m. And here's Peter Credlin.